And as they are departing the stage, we are going to pivot now to opportunities for U.S. suppliers of smart grid, energy storage, and demand management technologies with three fantastic expert industry presenters who are going to share their insights with us. DuPlessis from Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, Ty Roberts from Itron, and Richard Phillips from ESS. And as our moderator for this next session, it is my true pleasure to invite to the stage Ravi Vora, who retired from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in 2016 and began pursuing his passion to help commercialize disruptive technologies and create and foster clean energy and utility business models in emerging markets. Ravi has a significant track record in successfully developing, financing, and managing major power projects worldwide, and has worked extensively with companies and electric utilities, including in India and in South Africa, where he served as the Chief Renewable Energy Advisor for Eskom, of course, Africa's largest utility company. So Ravi, it's a true pleasure having you with us today. In introducing the session, Ravi will briefly share his firsthand insights on the needs of electric utilities in emerging markets, and then introduce each of our presenters to give their presentations, and then after each presentation, facilitate your questions and some discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, we want to thank Michael, CEDAR, and USAID for organizing a fantastic program. Lots of experts and insightful knowledge sharing. So thank you very much. I just want to make a few comments, and then I'll introduce each of our speakers as the plan is. So one of the key things to think about anytime we are looking for opportunities is who is going to be our customer, who is going to be the beneficiary of whatever technology or equipment we want to provide. So for this particular segment of the technology opportunities, there are basically three major customer base. One is the utility companies. They are what I call the backbone globally. The second would be the independent or power generators, but we'll particularly focus on renewable energy power producers or developers. And the third, which we don't think often, are who are responsible for operating the grid, because that's equally important. And I had the pleasure and privilege to wear the hat in all three areas, so I can see both sides of the fence. And it kind of reminds me, in my early career, when I ran a utility company in India, we had the pleasure of working with a lot of smart meter technology companies, battery storage companies. We did a slum electrification with the partners like the eminent experts we have, and we electrified 50,000 slums. So they got power without having to steal, and the utility company got more revenue. Similarly, when I have the pleasure of working with NREL, in fact, we were just in January invited to visit Tamil Nadu utility company in India. And one of the focus area there again was their technical and operational issues, both in managing aging infrastructure of the grid, but also how do we accommodate, maximize the value of large amount of renewable energy. So I think these are some of the examples that come to mind in terms of where our experts are going to share their insights. First, I want to introduce Andre. I think many of you have seen his profile. He is a global leader for the Schweitzer Engineering, very well-known name. Those of us who work internationally, highly respected, and very, very successful solution provider. But Andre and I have a common link. One link is that Andre's origins are from South Africa, where I and Mark Lyons, who was here, we spent a few years living and working there, and have a strong affinity for South Africa. And second, Andre told me that they're really proud for doing homeschooling for their children. And I told him, I said, the school I went to in India was also called homeschool. So without much ado, Andre, please share your knowledge and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for the warm introduction. So I guess we continue the South African theme now with a real South African presenting. So my apology for that. I promise that I will not say a word about South Africa, and I'll keep to that promise. Suzanne mentioned in her presentation, she mentioned weak grids. We love weak grids from our point of view, as a technology supplier, because the purpose of our company is to build reliability, right, and to prevent blackouts. In short, that's where we come from. So we're in the business to do that, and then Brandon mentioned that one of the 4 focus areas is digitization, right? We all agree on that. So, like Al Gore's claim to the internet, we can claim that we are the beginning of Smart Grid, our company. We have designed 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, the first digital relay, which at that point there was only mechanical relays in the system, and that revolutionized the power industry. So even with that first digital relay, we had a fault location built in. So that was 30 years ago. So just a quick from a technology supplier point of view. Sorry, before I forget, we are based in Washington State. We have manufacturing facilities in 3 states in the United States. A 100% US manufacturer. We are 100% employee-owned as well. So this is the space in which we operate this is your whole ecosystem in terms of from power generation through distribution, through transmission to distribution, and everything in between that we provide smart grid equipment, manufacture, and develop technologies in this space. Just to kind of highlight them, from protection, control, automation, computing, software, precise time, and then something that is becoming very, very timely, cybersecurity, and then metering, communications, and then also engineering services and training. So I would like to highlight 3 projects that we have done with DOE, NREL, and USAID that gave us a lot of visibility, and obviously as a result of the technical innovation that we pursue. So with NREL, a microgrid controller, and then with USAID, a pilot, distribution automation pilot in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and then in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. So with NREL, what we did is that we won a competitive procurement not very long ago, a couple of months ago actually, a competitive procurement to find the best microgrid control technology in the marketplace. This competitive procurement was focused, or the goal of that was to be installed in NREL's energy system integration facility. It was a 21-week microgrid as well as cybersecurity evaluation period, competed by 5 suppliers. We won that. Just a quick note on the cybersecurity evaluation, because the challenge with microgrid control technology these days is that from a transmission supply operator point of view, you don't know what's going on in your microgrids. So one of the vulnerabilities of that is cybersecurity. So as a result of that, integrated into this procurement and this project was cybersecurity. So that's one of the features in terms of this today's microgrid control technology, that you have to embed your OT cybersecurity technologies in that in order to be successful. So just a recap, a microgrid controller basically is the heart of the operation, right? That takes your different generation sources and it makes it one. It manages that on a microsecond basis. It balances load with generation. So that essentially is the brain, the core of a microgrid. It can be sized from anything from a few solar panels, obviously, to the size and scope of a city of Denver type model. So jumping over to Bosnia, what we did with, it was a project in collaboration with US Energy Association and USAID, where we cost shared. We went in with this idea, which manifested into a cost share arrangement between us as a supplier, technology provider, and US Energy Association and USAID, as well as the customer, the community. The Britsko, northern part of Bosnia, the Britsko municipal distribution utility, they also cost share. So all parties cost share into this. It was a pilot to provide automation equipment and software for just 2 distribution feeders. And this pilot was serving as a demonstration model project for Bosnia and for the region. Here are the outcomes of that project. We have a 51% reduction over a 2-year period in number of outages. We have a 58% reduction in duration of outages. And then because of the successful fault location, that saves the repair time. You don't need to send your maintenance crews out all the time. And that maintenance reduction also increased since this automatic system now can obviously reply and ignore it operates on and identifies your temporary faults, but it also recloses again if it's a temporary fault, so you don't need to chase after that. So this was a small project, but a very successful project from a technology point of view and from a demonstration point of view. For this, we received the USCA Project of the Year Award 2016. And just a short quote here from the president of that community. After years of problems, frequent power cuts, and long-lasting interruptions, residents in this local community have a regular supply of electricity, which is super cool for us because this is a problem that obviously we as reliability providers, if you will, across the world, especially in the markets that we discussed today, that is a huge problem, obviously, on the distribution side. On the transmission side, another project that we did with USAID, and in this case, it's not a localized, this is a countrywide automated emergency load shedding system that countrywide operates under like 28 milliseconds, extremely fast. The purpose was to prevent unplanned power blackouts. We did this, as I mentioned, with USAID. And at the point when we introduced this technology to Georgia, not even Europe, not even the EU had these technologies. So the outcomes of this project, very successful similarly. In a 28-month period, we prevented 20 power blackouts. This is based on the customers, the GSE, the utilities records. And also based on their calculation, the GDP of Georgia at that time was about 1.95 million per hour. Assuming an average duration of 1 hour per blackout, this solution has saved Georgia $39 million for a investment cost of only $2 million, more or less. And this is only for a 28-month period. And we know, for those familiar with that region and with Georgia particularly, they have had these blackouts for many, many, many years. So this system operates successfully every month. I just want to highlight the USAID relationship here. The first phase was completely funded by USAID and was managed by Tetra Tech, the procurement. It was a competitive procurement. We won that procurement. The second phase, we were contracted by the customer directly as a result of the success of the first phase. Then we developed the second phase of that project. And then completely independent from the blackout management project, the customer had a 10 substation rehabilitation project, also funded by USAID, which we bid and we won, but all circling back basically to that first project that we had a shot at through USAID. So just a reflection on our type of customers in the Latin America, Asia, and Africa region. So we focus on power utilities, on industrial companies like refineries, industrial processing. And then with power utilities, as I mentioned, from generation, transmission, and distribution companies, public and private, and mostly in the secondary equipment or the smart grid sphere. We don't do primary equipment. We only do secondary equipment: power protection, control automation, software, and services. So I think we all agree on pretty much on the market growth that we see ourselves for these regions. Renewable energy grid integration, an enormous injection of especially variable renewable energy. That from our perspective, from the renewable energy developer perspective and investors, that's fantastic, right? But from our perspective as a technology supplier, it creates havoc on the grid for us, from a reliability point of view. So your renewable grid integration from a technology perspective is one of the great market opportunities for us as a supplier. And then obviously microgrids with your distributed generation and automation. There's a lot to be done with automation, and cybersecurity is becoming very, very much on the something that's being pushed from a technology point of view. And here we have to differentiate. I think, Brendan, you mentioned OT. We have to clearly differentiate between IT and between OT, right? What we're talking about here is OT, operational technology, cybersecurity. So in terms of these markets for us, we see Latin America as probably the most receptible at this point for these solutions. In second place, Asia, and in third place, the African markets. And then I think substations, new and rehabilitated as well, a big market growth opportunity for us in terms of your infrastructure that's being built, that's being constantly being built in your developing countries. So from our vantage point, from a technology supplier point of view, we see successful. The technical success in products we see as products that provide secure communications, given your cyber, your security vulnerability side of the business, and then the speed of operation. The speed of operation is becoming much more important for us these days. We can see that with the twitchiness in the grid, especially weak systems where you introduce renewable energy. The faster you operate a grid, the more success you have in terms of reliability. So at this point, our company, we have released the fastest, last year we released the fastest transmission relay in the world, which operates between 1 and 5 milliseconds. Nobody has replicated that yet. So that's where we are. We are actually moving potentially into the nanosecond sphere. That's pretty much the next domain to conquer for us as a technology supplier. So speed of operation important, and then quality as a US supplier. It is extremely important. We all agree on that. Quality comes with US, right? But not only that, in the markets that the extreme environmental conditions, quality is something that we just have. We cannot ignore that. So quality, simplicity. We all agree that we work in markets that engineers not always understand the technologies. For this photo here, we have a touch screen relay device, which just makes it so much easier, right, for a technician or an engineer to go and program his digital devices, smart grid devices on the grid. And then interoperability. Interoperability for us and in the marketplace is extremely important, because we have gone and see so many instances where there are so many different vendors' products in, for example, a substation. It would be GE, ABB, Siemens, Alstom, and neither one talks to each other, right? So those are issues that are becoming more and more technical issues as we move into the automation and into those kinds of requirements. Price, don't say anything more about that. We have to we compete against the Chinese. We compete against, excuse me, Ravi, the Indians. And then support and training. Support and training goes also without any explanation. We cannot release our products without that, and also in multilingual environments, language support, all of that. So for us, the market challenges, again, from our perspective as a supplier that only supplies your secondary equipment, we have the primary versus secondary equipment the challenge for us. Most procurements combine primary and secondary equipment in the marketplace. If you have a large procurement coming out, it's primary and secondary equipment combined. We are a mid-sized company only producing this type of equipment. How do we go in? How do we bid? That's a challenge for us, right? So we can only bid solutions that we can bid. But again, secondary is a problem for us. The other challenge for us is large turnkey projects for, that your larger EPC companies are normally bidding, and so forth. The foreign finance projects and international competition, that is a very strong one for us. And then export opportunities for us. We have a fantastic development that we see that your MDBs, your multilateral development banks are focusing on quality, value for money principles, much more than just lowest cost bidder. And then the customer relationship is king for us. You have to have a customer relationship. That was mentioned. Brandon again mentioned that. It is key for us in terms of conceptualizing projects, and we cannot bid on a turnkey project. Utilize US agencies and team with other suppliers complementary to your skill sets. And build relationships ahead of procurement with your EPC companies, not when that procurement is on the cards. Then the lessons learned for us. Two types of opportunities. I think we're running out of time here. I'll go very quickly through this. Two types of opportunities, bidding on published projects and then assist the customer to develop projects. Those are the two methodologies that we follow. And long-term effort and trust building in terms of your project, your project conceptual development with a customer, that's key. Utilize DFI, development finance institutions, brown bag opportunities, especially for smaller mid-sized companies. Those opportunities are key with these banks. These are examples of our renewable energy projects that we have done. We have done some work in Mexico on a solar wind farm there, 85 kilowatts. And then in Ghana, we supplied the integration on the Kosombo Dam, 10,000 megawatt. And then again in Mexico, we did a 13.8 kilovolt project there. Kintampu, Export-Import Bank project that we did in Ghana. A quick recap on that. And then this is our international offices. We have international offices in 24 countries. Last slide, we have products in 157 countries. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Andre, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Couple of observations. I think you pointed out that one of the things you focus on is user-friendly and make it easier for the users, your technology. I think that's an important lesson perhaps you're sharing. The other part I thought I wanted to connect your observations with Brandon's presentation, where it may make sense for mid-sized companies to team up with multinationals and effectively collaborate together and, if I can say bluntly, piggyback with the large multinationals to do a mutually beneficial partnership to pursue projects where their expertise and staying power might be of benefit. The third thing I want to mention, then I will open up the forum for questions and answers. I think one of the key things that we're going to learn from not only Andre's presentation, but also the other two that's coming up, is the smart technology. I want to call it smart technology for grid or otherwise, has two other important but intangible benefits. One is it actually brings transparency in the way the systems operate. and the users and operators, everybody, it becomes a transparent process, which is really, really valuable for all stakeholders. The second thing it does do is actually does deter, if not eliminate, corruption. I think that we cannot underestimate the importance and the value of these technologies that we're going to discuss on how it actually creates a very institutional benefits that's going to be so critical. But I'd welcome questions from the audience.
Yep, great. One right over here, and then others, raise your hands, and we'll get the mic to you, please. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Osiris Stevens, CEO of Next Step Electric. And I was listening to you about what you do with your microgrids. I'm a Durham system is what I do. And we also have a millionth of a second data, and it's done by a radio made here in the United States. It's DoD approved. Maybe you and I should probably sit down and talk. I can speed you up on your data collection. My biggest question is, have any of you in this room thought of how to offset your cost through food? We have a completely solar greenhouse that can help offset the cost or be autonomous, just all by itself, and create electricity for the locals. Also creates food. We also have a water generation device in there as well, so we're making clean drinking water. Have any of you in this room at all ever thought of doing that to offset your cost for your commercial folks? So then they become heroes instead of zeros.
Any thoughts on that? And I'll also invite any other questions or observations from the audience. Great. Okay.
I'd like to see if any of my colleagues want to respond or comment. Okay.
Hello, my name is Santiago. I work for Apt Associates. Andrea, thanks for the presentation. What I wanted to ask is, some of the examples that you gave were working with USAID in other countries, and I wanted to understand better your perspective in terms of how that partnership or those projects with USAID and other partners helped you to go to those markets. And the question is, did it provide more like access to decision makers, or did it help you identify the opportunities? Was there lower risk for you? Was there any sort of benefits for you as a company to try to participate, in these partnerships? And then the second question would be, now that you've done that and you've worked with other banks, do you think it would be easier for you to go into other countries? And obviously you work in many, many countries. So what I'm trying to understand is really what made those steps possible for you to go into all those markets?
Thank you. I think the biggest benefit for us was as leveraging for us the power of convening, right? Of convening the right folks together in the room, and in leveraging that opportunity for us as a technology supplier. Because remember, we don't need to mention that. We know that as international technology suppliers, competition is stiff. It's incredibly stiff, especially against in Europe, Eastern Europe, those kind of places, and Africa, where you have the colonial legacy of the colonial suppliers. It's the door opener. So the door opener for us through your convening, power of convening, and that opened for us the opportunity, on which we then built the second success, the third success, and then eventually that actually allowed us, in terms of the Georgia project, for example, that opened up a complete a footprint in terms of that technology, legacy actually, which we now can take to Africa, which we can take to Latin America, to other markets as well, simply because those are, even though that it's technologies that have been in operation for quite a while, it's not a technology that's being tested, if you will, but it still is a new technology, and now suddenly we have these technologies in operation in foreign markets, not only in the US anymore, that's being tested under those conditions, environmental conditions and regulatory conditions and all sorts of things, which now is standing the test of time. And now with that, we can go, that allowed us, for example, to go to the Asia Development Bank and do presentations, to go to the Africa Development Bank in Abidjan to do presentations. So now that allowed us to leverage a complete kind of like supply chain, if you will, on the back, on piggybacking on that particular project where USAID was, and USEA for that matter, was instrumental in opening up for us that door. So it's opening the door. That is the value that was, for us, the most important factor.
We have another one? Yep, thanks.
Hi, I'm Jordan Dansby from Clean Energy Council. Andre, I've spent most of my career representing export credit agencies and DFIs and multilaterals, and I was a little intrigued to hear your kind of interest in connecting with those types of lenders, given the kind of role that your company, I'm imagining, would play in some of these big projects that a lot of these DFIs and multilaterals are financing. And now in my current role, I'm representing more developers and exporters and manufacturers. And so I'd be curious to understand what were you proposing to these lenders? What interest were they taking in you guys as providers of components into larger projects? Because in my experience, you know, by the time these big lenders came in, they were pretty agnostic, except for ECAs like Exim Bank, which are set up to promote U.S. and manufacturing. But for the others, they were pretty agnostic as to the component parts and other things that went into the projects. What they wanted to know is, can I get an assignment of your warranty? But other than that, I was just curious how you guys were able to leverage connections with those banks to increase your sales, I guess.
You know what? I think contrary to the perception that some of those projects, may have created, we have not. We don't operate. We don't do large projects purely because we're a middle-sized company, right? So we don't go in with a bunch of credit and finance behind us. We have to go in kind of like small scale, if you will. So we set out in terms of the financing. We engage the lender, the borrower, actually. We engage the borrower, and we present the solution. Well, first of all, we need to find out what the problem is, right? So if we can solve a problem for that particular utility, if we've managed to bridge that, and yes, we like your solution, it's the best thing since sliced bread, let's see what we can do now. And then we introduce, at that point, because there's always a financing requirement. At that point, we then introduce Exim Bank, and we say, hey, this is what Exim Bank can do for you. Well, if you want to go the TDA route, this is what TDA can do for you, and so forth. So it's only at that point that we introduce it, keeping in mind that this is basically from a large multinational. This is kind of like peanuts, right? These are small projects that we talk about. These are not multi-million-dollar projects. So, and that's why it's kind of like manageable on that scale. Then we can, and then the discussion shifts from us to the borrower and Exim Bank, or the borrower and TDA to deliver the feasibility and so forth. And we can introduce a consultant, and then you just move it forward from that point of view. But I think the key here to introduce that is you have to make that first hurdle count. You have to introduce a success story. You have to introduce a technology that works, that's an answer to problems. Microgrids, I could just imagine what's going on with microgrids in developing countries right now. So you have to introduce something that works. If the borrower is fixed on that, if you've convinced him, then that makes the financing relatively smooth and easy. That's kind of like our experience.
Thank you very much, Andre. We should move on. And there may be some time, and we can pick up any more questions or thoughts. I'd like to introduce Ty Roberts. He heads up global marketing for Itron, very well-known international name in the smart meters and related solutions. One of the common interests Ty and I share is international travel and living. That's right. And I was delighted to learn that one of the things he and his family enjoy is traveling by railways. So there are other things in life besides what we talk about today.
Sometimes.
But thank you, Ty, and please share your knowledge and experience.
Thank you, Ravi. I try to avoid the self-destruct button. So a tiny bit of an introduction about Itron, because I think what is absolutely true after listening to you guys and talking to several of you, I think we have underutilized and I think underappreciated the role of USAID historically. I'm very excited about some of the ideas that I'm hearing from the room today and hoping that we can correct that going forward. So our legacy, founded in 1977, focused on really optimizing meter-to-cash processes. So this was automated meter reading to begin with. And then in the mid-2000s, we actually ended up swallowing the whale, as it were, and buying much of Schlumberger's metering business, much larger company than ourselves. That gave us a global footprint that we did not have before. So around the world, ironically, though the first 30 years of our history wasn't this way, we are known as a metering company. This is gas, electric, water. Over the last 15 years or so, our investment has been pretty heavily centralized on building communication systems and holistic AMI or smart metering systems, which more recently we've evolved to be sort of ubiquitous telecommunication systems that can link multiple services, multiple kinds of devices together to create new outcomes for our utilities are our typical customer, but we do some work with large commercial industrials as well. So a bit about Itron. So I have sort of a three-part presentation here. I wanted to talk about Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and I'm kind of doing it in that order because I see that there's a bit of a continuum here, which I think you guys may experience and appreciate already. But to focus on Africa and the challenges that we have in particular, this is the most sort of exacerbated case of this regionally that we see very obviously. So in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, from a wealth creation perspective, from a GDP, the countries there are the red blocks, largely are largely at the low end of the scale. So the economics there are challenging for projects, as well as this point on the side that the energy consumption per capita, per person is very low, as are the rates extremely low. So that leads to the big drivers in the region very obviously being electrification. So the chart on the left is really showing the percentage of the population for a few of the bigger countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, the rates of electrification within each, which are very low. So that's the absolute driver. And when we see, again, just another view of the value of that electricity that's being generated and distributed to the end customer is incredibly low from a per annum perspective. So starting big projects and looking at the things that we traditionally look at in North America and elsewhere, optimization of the utilization of the resource, it just doesn't move the needle. It doesn't matter in those locations. But that doesn't mean that there aren't real challenges to solve and to address, which really gets to some of the way things are today versus where we see the opportunities in this region evolving to. So today, in most of Africa, sub-Saharan and northern Africa as well, as Itron as a company are selling pretty uninteresting commodity products, which we would prefer not to do. And actually, we're sort of backing out of that market because the price pressures are enormous. So there's a lot of very simple, basic meters that we sell to those let's just read what's being consumed. There's no communications. There's no automatic collection of that data. Low prices, extremely low prices. You can buy a pizza for more money than you can buy a meter, and a meter has to last for 20 years, unlike a pizza. So very challenging environment, and frankly, this is where Chinese manufacturers and others that can absolutely drop the bottom out of commodity prices for these kind of devices, they beat Western providers or suppliers every day of the week. Also, from a cost recovery perspective, even with low prices for the tools and the assets the utilities are putting in the ground, But the operational expense and the CapEx expense, when you put these together for the business they're doing today, are completely upside down with the amount of money that they're collecting for the commodity, the electricity that they're delivering. Such to the point that this chart on the right here shows African countries. The little circle in the middle shows what they're actually collecting for a kilowatt hour versus what they're actually paying to produce and deliver that, broken out by operating expense in orange and capital expense in green, so completely out of whack. That has been driven traditionally by heavy subsidization, rather, which was talked about by a few speakers already today, which gives a very false representation of the true cost of delivering that commodity. That's a problem, obviously, as was mentioned before, for introducing distributed generation. It's a problem for introducing, frankly, any asset into this market. With that sort of a completely artificial cost structure that's hiding the true cost of power, there comes the other two pieces of really what's a vicious cycle that we see here is the ability to provide a quality service to the customer, so reliability primarily, is extremely low, as is which in turn precipitates non-technical losses or theft. If you're getting a bad service and you're not paying very much for it, then, well, let's take matters into our own hands and try to circumvent that process and steal power, creates this cycle where then there's less money coming in to actually support and sustain the service in the first place, and it further degrades in terms of reliability. So it's a vicious cycle. What we also see in Africa is because these are large, stable, government-owned, stable despite the fact that the business models are upside down, they are they're factories for employment, essentially. So people can work for utilities in large scale to the point where, again, it's further burdening the cost structure of the utility. So the amount of labor force expense that utilities are carrying is far outstrips the ability for them to recover that cost. So lots of problems with that model. So where we see some opportunity, and I'll talk a little about where we've seen this realized in Latin America in particular, is attempting, and I think you have to do this incrementally, is improving the utility management side of this first. So you have to improve the quality of the product for people to care about it, for people to be willing to pay more for it and to take it not quite for granted as they're doing today. So that means solving some real problems for the utility. So what we've seen with projects, especially large-scale ones that attempt to start throughout the Africa, sub-Saharan and northern, is lots of asset being brought into place, big projects to deploy smart meters in the case where Itron is involved, that the procurement process is very heavily weighted towards cost optimization. And as David talked about earlier, the premium placed on value just isn't there at all, so it's low cost. Most of these projects have a big price tag when they begin, not much margin in it for the suppliers, and frankly, they end up failing because they either don't start or they do start and they limp along. The technology isn't holding together. The service providers are not adept or used to delivering these large programs, and they end up failing. And then the process starts again. The way to address this that we see is starting small and incrementally and tackling some of these problems. Let's focus on the improving of reliability. Let's focus on improving the revenue assurance process. So let's prevent or detect theft where it's occurring and try to slowly reverse that vicious cycle to turn it into a virtuous one. That will allow the utility in this case to slowly introduce more cost-effective or tariffs that are more right-sized with in terms of the commodity, the cost of the commodity that's being delivered. And reducing the expenditure of overstaffing. So discrete projects that can be run reasonably autonomously with a small staff, technology that's user-friendly, so that there's not bloat in terms of the amount of expertise that's required to management are all very key. And this is where I completely agree with a few of the speakers who've gone previous to this. The utilities in these regions are often national, so they're massively influential at a government level, massively influential in terms of the structure of behind the regulation. Fighting that is incredibly difficult. Where we've been trying to work and incrementally make some changes is having these folks realize that the way to improve their product, their service, and increase their revenue load is to look at embedding microgrid technologies, being able to manage those in a sort of a network provider or network of networks kind of a model where they have boots on the ground, they have expertise, they can service a lot of this capability if they allow it to happen. But a lot of the models in place today from a regulatory perspective just don't support that. From a potential for U.S. suppliers perspective, regional influence in Northern Africa, and this is largely an artifact of colonialization, is there's a heavy affinity for European technology, France in particular, where smart metering, smart grid technologies have been developed for large national companies in Europe, like Enedis in France, Enel in Italy, Iberdrola in Spain. Those technologies are being exported to the countries where they have a historical connection. That's a challenge to overcome in Northern Africa. It can be, however. There's openness to do business with other providers. And as many people have already said, local content is a must. Figuring out how to introduce that is the challenge and the key part. I was talking to Suzanne a bit earlier in the break that, and she mentioned it in her initial speech, was keeping the core of the capability that you're delivering to the market that you know has to work and has to be reliable intact, and not introducing local content into that fundamental piece is pretty key for us. Adding it around the edges, having services and add-on capabilities, value-add capabilities being brought in by the local parties is absolutely fundamental, but making sure that the thing works and solves the problem you're selling it to solve is key. Also, just generally in Africa, this is big from an Itron perspective, is telecommunications infrastructure, because we have lots of communicating assets and networks that require, obviously, communication to bring data from the field into the back office of the utility. The lack of an infrastructure in place that's reliable from a cellular carrier provider is an issue. There's not a lot of fiber in Africa as well, obviously. So finding partners for us that allow us to bridge that gap is an important piece. And just understanding that there's often a lack of operational expertise in country for some of these more complex solutions. So you have to provide services in a way that don't overburden the utility staff. From an opportunity perspective, optimizing capital investment, so leveraging product that you're selling at high volume in other markets is critical for this. We spent a lot of time building specialized products for different regions in Africa, which seems like a great idea until you're competing on cost and price, and it just doesn't scale from that perspective. Interesting, software as a service, or outcomes as a service as we call it, where the operation of the system is something that the supplier retains or a IT services provider retains on behalf of the utility, can be a great way to reduce that overburdening of cost from an OpEx perspective. It's just providing the utility, here's the problem you need to solve, here's the data that you need to generate invoices, here's who's stealing power from you. Giving them something actionable that they can do versus expecting a large staff on their side just to run that for them can be a key to lowering some of that OpEx expense. And I made the local content comment already. So translating some of that to Central and South America, I think what's interesting here is we have seen, I think Latin America is roughly where Africa, or rather, Africa is where Latin America was probably in the mid-90s or late 80s, where what happened starting with Chile was privatization of the national utilities, which really turned exactly the same problems of subsidized cost of power or gas, water, whatever the case was, and a a real challenge in terms of collecting enough revenue to offset that cost. And service, quality of service being massive, massive issues. Those have turned around in a lot of places in many countries within Latin America, which is very exciting to see. It's not pervasive completely yet, but it's absolutely turning that way. What we have seen, however, that's interesting developed there is the non-technical loss or the theft component has decreased absolutely in some regions, but region-wide is still very high. Although the service rates of service have improved and standards of service have improved, we see that the cost, the lack of subsidy on the cost of power has really driven the rate of theft up. So you can't have all the spokes within this wheel have to be well aligned in order for it to turn properly. If you have anything that's out of balance, you're going to run into the same problems as the Africa case. Here's a wonderful, the most egregious, this is what non-technical losses looks like. I think this is in Sao Paulo, I believe. It looks like it, right? I've never seen that bad in person, but this is reality, and this is what theft looks like. It's not good. Potential, again, for U.S. suppliers in this region, we're seeing lots more, just as I talked about in North Africa, there are acquisitions being driven from the large European utilities in the region, in Brazil in particular. Anywhere where there's privatization has occurred, we're seeing a lot more purchasing or acquisition of utilities by Iberdrola, for example, or parent companies in Europe. And of course, their automatic first step is to let's export the technology that we've specified and built ourselves in our home country there. Although there's more pragmatism, I would say, to it's not the same network, it's not the same challenges to resolve, so there's some pragmatism to work with US providers and other providers in the world, which is very helpful. Again, I think leveraging products and volume from US market, there is a willingness to do that if it's going to solve problems in the region. And lastly, Asia Pacific, since I have 2 minutes left. Much more advanced in this case in terms of, this is sort of the end of the continuum for me, being driven largely by large economic powerhouses, technology powerhouses in region in terms of Japan, South Korea, China, Australia, for example, where there are absolutely pockets of electrification still occurring. There is a high incidence of non-technical loss, of theft in different countries as well, so it's a bit of a mix. But what's interesting here that we're seeing is especially the mega city in the region really driving this new concept of smart city being an absolute trend that we see holistically melded with utilities as well. So from a projection in terms of revenue, smart city revenue from a communications infrastructure perspective, you see Asia Pacific is the blue bar. It is growing the fastest over time, and that's not all China as well. That's obviously a big driver, but that is spreading out from to all of the mega cities within the region, which is a fabulous, I think, development from a opportunity perspective. What you'll also see, this grid is, or this chart is showing what the breakdown by commodity. So a lot of the drive for that smart city business is being driven by energy and water savings. So this is directly and squarely in the wheelhouse of utilities. So there's a real intersection of opportunity here where ubiquitous networks that can serve both utilities and smart cities, adding different services on top of that, is an absolute driver here for opportunity and for business going forward. Actually, and I'm going to get the hook, and I made my key points. So last point I will make here, the game that we've been playing as U.S. suppliers into this market is often a specification game against local Asian providers as well as European. This is a front where everybody in the world is playing right now because it's quite open in terms of standards. It's who can get their specification in first and cemented with the utility or the city or the government entity fastest. That then eliminates competition. It's a nasty game, frankly, with not a lot of upside to the purchaser, but it's how it's being played. And I'll pause at that point. Thank you, guys.
Questions? That was fantastic presentation. Raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. Got one right over here. Thank you.
Hi, Jason Nagy, Mainspring Innovation, based here in Denver. I'm interested in this issue of willingness to pay, and particularly in Africa and the prepaid metering market. That, along with kind of the business models of who and how to partner, what do you have to give up in order to get business, and that kind of thinking in terms of the utility or working with a local startup type partner or an accredited group, and
Sure.
and the items around procurement versus building something.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for noting. I didn't talk about it explicitly, but prepayment is an absolute force and a great go-to-market model in Africa, in particular. We see that as well as centralized metering, which is essentially taking the meters out of the homes or the individual premise and putting them up on a pole somewhere, so a small neighborhood will be metered centrally to prevent tampering. Both of those are mechanisms that are obviously that help prevent non-technical loss. They're not foolproof, however, they can be bypassed, and I think where we've seen is without changing that dynamic of making it worth it to pay for power and not to steal it, essentially, you can come up with pretty static approaches to defending against those theft vectors. But people are smart. If you put a prepayment meter or a centralized meter in their neighborhood, they're going to think about it for a few weeks and figure out how to circumvent it, and that absolutely happens pretty regularly. So that's one tool in the chest, but you need a bigger arsenal to solve the problem. From a go-to-market and collaboration perspective, I think what we've seen absolutely is in every country where we as Itron don't have a significant footprint, which is many of them, we have to go to market through a distributor or a channel partner. Often that is so they're essentially the face. They're the sales team leading and they're the leading contact with the customer, with the regulators in country, at the government level, and they almost always have to bring some sort of capability that they add to your solution. That can be IT services, that can be hardware components that they add around the solution itself. And in some cases, we've done some kitting of products that we manufacture, shipping that in country, and they do the final assembly, and maybe add a component or two. That's also possible, but it's a must. And I think also what's interesting is, especially when you're trying to solve complex problems like preventing theft, revenue assurance in general, and improving. Just improving operational efficiency and the robustness of the service that's being delivered. The challenges are different region by region, similar but different enough where if you can find a local provider that knows how to solve that per the local challenges and can evolve that solution over time to keep up with the evolution of the challenge itself, that's really important, because as a centralized provider, what we try to focus on is delivering platforms that you can build those capabilities and evolve them over time to keep them relevant and current. And that's where having local parties involved is really important.
Hi, Pramod Jain. Two quick questions. One is communication is really important. So in your opinion, which technology or which protocols are we going to settle on in the future? There are a lot of competing technologies fighting. Second question is, in smart city applications, do you see street lighting and related applications? Are they useful? Are they just a diversion to the real issues?
Great questions. I'll probably forget the second one by the time I'm done with the first, so you can remind me. But as far as what protocols are going to be used going forward, so we've made some bets at Itron. But we're also not so naive to know that as a buyer and as the seller, having that reality, that is a reality, that there's really no one-size-fits-all communication solution. Having to support some cellular, having to support some radio frequency, power line carrier, long range, those are all tools that you have to have in the tool chest. So that's our belief, and that will be different region by region, depending on how much energy and money is behind promoting one or the other. From a smart city and street light, I did remember. So I think it depends on the region. Where if you're replacing sodium lights with an LED, for example, I mean, that's a terrific saving, energy saving right there. We do see some incremental benefit from putting in streetlight control just from a pure cost perspective. The real benefits we see, however, from a quality of service. So there's a lot more you can do in terms of specialized lighting, neighborhood lighting, that are really only possible if you have a control system. So it's about quality beyond much more than it is, and value much more than it is about cost at that point. Incremental benefits from control, to optimally controlling to reduce spend, but it's really about service you can deliver.
Great. We have time for one more question. I've got Ignacio. Okay.
My question is, what is your experience on prepaid meters? As you know, they're very controversial. We looked at them with KPLC in Nairobi, and there's all kinds of issues. So I'm just wondering whether you guys have prepaid meters, or if not, what is your experience with them?
Yeah, we have many, and I have to do my obligatory South African shout out, I think. We saw lots of them there. And ironically, so the two biggest markets for prepaid meters are in South Africa and actually in the UK. For very different reasons. Yeah, in the UK, it's seen as it's a value. It's not punitive at all, which is not the experience in some places. I've seen pictures of we've installed prepaid meters, or utilities we worked with have installed prepaid meters in a neighborhood. The next day, they're all in a big pile in the middle of the street on fire. So it's all about conditioning the customer as to this is why this is good for you, this is why this is valuable and useful for you and not punitive for you. And if you don't do that work up front as a utility, then that's how they'll be seen.
We have a couple more questions, but I think we have to move on to our next presentation. We will have some Q&A after that too, so please, ladies, hold your questions and let's go on. Yeah.
A penny's worth of input I'll share to what I shared and the questions raised here is that when we did slum electrification many years ago, one of the important partners we had were social non-government organizations that were embedded in those communities. And actually, they were the enablers to overcome the challenges that you describe and many in this audience know. I want to turn to the last but not the least presentation. Richard Phillips shares mutual heritage of dual country. So Richard, his heritage is both Brazil and United States, and he'll be sharing amazing a perspective about opportunities and the progress being made for the role of energy storage. Particular company, ESS, offers iron flow batteries. Some of the techies know the difference. But more importantly, he's going to share what are the benefits for the utility companies, for the consumers, and ultimately the cost to serve with the role of the energy storage solutions in Latin America. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, and thank you, USAID, for inviting us here today. And I must acknowledge the role that USTDA and the U.S. Department of Commercial Service has done to help us bring technology to Latin America. So I can safely say that you really do want to spend time there. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile. And frankly, there's a tremendous credential that comes with their endorsement. So the other thing I'd like to do is acknowledge two obvious big facts. I agree with Brendan, I agree with Ethan, I agree with Suzanne, and yet I'm coming, if you turn the telescope upside down, I'm sort of looking from the lens of being in Brazil outward at American suppliers and how they penetrate these markets. Of course, the added strangeness, if you will, is energy storage. What's going to happen? I mean, it's the speculative aspects of technology, cost, use case drivers, things of this are enormous. So I think it's fair to say that first, there isn't a fits all. There's going to be a wide variance of applications. And the real thing we need to do as a collective market is to determine where do we place our bets, or not so much on a technology basis, but which applications do we think will provide the greatest benefit. In this case, I'm speaking from a Latin American and principally emphasize Brazil because it is the largest market. Recognize that Chile got off to a fast start, but I think you're going to fairly see that Brazil will overwhelm Chile here very shortly. I know that in the auctions that have been restarted, they've promised a lot, and we are waiting to see whether they will deliver. Because as you well know, Ethan, they haven't. Historically speaking, at least a third of the auctions fail. So, and they fail because they weren't qualified bids, if you really get down to it. So the backing, I think there's a couple other aspects that we should recognize. One is environmental regulations, and the other is taxes. This is a highly regulated and controlled market. So nobody should go there unadvisedly. It's not going to be necessarily easy or fast. In our case, we're almost 3 years on the ground with this one particular area. And we've partnered with Brazilians, and we're building business models. I think that's the question. Where is the business model that will drive the adoption? We believe that we're approaching the inflection point where you will see, I guess I could sit here and talk about this without actually using any slides at all, but they said, well, you should, all of this has been said. So frankly, I mean, the idea that the grid is unreliable, the idea that there are places that don't even have reliable energy in any form. I want to talk expressly also about isolated grids, diesel grids, and the potential to be migrated to diesel hybrid grids. Some of the largest diesel grids in the world are in Brazil, in the Amazon basin. This is a place where greater than 2,000 generators run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think people don't fully appreciate that. I don't remember if that's on this slide or another. So I am going to talk about the grid operators as well, because I mean, there's no question the regulated market and the direction and changes in this particular area are relevant to our discussion. I happen to believe that DG and the private market will be leading Brazil. There's no question they will essentially be competing with the regulated grid operators. So let's see what else we got. Weak infrastructure, supplement the grid, all that you know. The size of the market is, the served available market, and I didn't have room to write out available market in full letters. My error, I'm not the skilled tactician here, is about $2 billion in 2020. So what you have to think of, in my opinion, this is the way I see it. You start with a market that has a need that is genuine and a relatively high cost of electricity. And I mean, the cost of electricity in Brazil, which is the largest market, is far higher. So yes, there are impediments in the area of taxes, regulations, environmental protection, things of this nature. But you're starting from a very high price with an economy that's coming out of recession, and they do have a tendency to come out hot. I mean, they don't, I can tell you from my observation that is in fact taking place there today. On the other hand, I would say the regulated market will lag the private sector. So I believe the bigger opportunity, these are just the numbers, so you can go back to the numbers that are in the graph and you'll be able to pull all of the individual data points. This is a particular use case model that we've recently looked at for a C&I application, relatively large C&I application. And we believe that energy storage is the missing link, and that this is the thing that will, how do I say this in a way, the best way? It's really people in the commercial and industrial space are ready to flee the grid. I don't know, would anyone disagree with that? Raise your hand. In these countries where energy reliability, cost, taxes, I mean, 35% of your energy bill is taxes in Brazil, nominally. It's a very significant factor. The other thing we have going is I'm trying to think of what they call it, but it's a flag system. When water is low and the predominant generation source that's economic and baseload is hydro. So when they have acute problems in that area, of course they have to fire off their gas turbines and so forth, and some of which are diesel. You know, they aren't even that modern. So again, I would agree with our friend from GE that there's a big opportunity to improve their power plants as well. So even though I'm talking about using energy storage in particular in behind the meter applications, in isolated grid applications, these are the places I believe that will be the first movers. And that's true in all of Latin America, by the way. So I'm speaking particularly about Brazil, but this particular tendency applies to all of them. If you're an industrial factory trying to operate off of an isolated diesel grid in say, we call it Zona Franca, or the Amazon basin and all the states involved, you don't have energy every day. You say you're a continuous flow manufacturer, like a glass factory, of which there are many there. One power outage, you have to restart your plant. The whole thing, you lose the entire day's production, and the next morning you show up and restart it all from a cold start. These are very expensive. Another large industry in Brazil, where we talk about private, is the meatpacking industry. Once you have a product that's perishable and you must have energy, you basically every one of these people have diesel generators. I've not seen a country with the predominant use of diesel power, and very expensive there too, by the way, because of all the other tendencies I've already spoken about. These are private industries ripe to defect the grid and supplement their capacity. So we hope we'll be showing that through a pilot demonstration project very soon. And Brazil is at an inflection point from an economic standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint. So now sliding over to the grid operators, so I don't miss any of those guys. These guys are the elephant in the room for sure, but recognize that 80% of the grid operators have either recently gone through a public-private partnership or will be going through a refinancing of their debt. And their state grid, Engie or Engie, NL Green Power, and the NL, all these guys are slowly buying up the Brazilian regulated industry. And they're going to be a huge player. There's no doubt. But they're also slow. They're basically at the moment in what I call R&D phase. So they have mandated projects, of which you may very well be interested. They're called Chamada 21 or Chamada 21. And this was mandated by the regulator that they must buy energy storage, energy efficiency, smart grid, and implement it. And I know GE again is well in the mix there. I don't want to say we share mutual customers, because I couldn't be so bold as to say that yet. But I'd like to say that soon. Yeah, yet being the key word. That's why I added that. Okay. Now I really do apologize. These are just classic U.S. examples. To me, I really don't find them. One of the other things I should make as a point: don't go there thinking you're just going to do what you do here. If you do that, if you don't get boots on the ground, all the things Brendan talked about with regard to knowing the market, and then last but not least, expect distortional influence in the government policy side. So we need stronger, more stable regulation, and of course, signals, market signals, so that the behavior stimulated is responsive to energy efficiency, lower cost. Notwithstanding all that, last I'll say, the largest, to my knowledge, and I'm looking for a challenge here, diesel generator grid in the world will be up for a 15-year concession bid yet this year. 400,000 people powered off only diesel generators in an isolated grid. Something on the order of 300 generators that some large majority run continuously. So just imagine what it costs. Now, there's lots of distortional things. There's fuel subsidies, there's efficiency standards. It isn't going to be easy for an American or a U.S. entity to penetrate that world, but they need it, and we need to be there and create the opportunity. We have a program there called Luz para Todos, which is light for everyone in Portuguese. And it failed, to be honest. They put it in place some years ago in the early 2000s, but they're re-energizing it with new technology, some of which is coming from America. I wish there would be more. But again, thank you, USTDA. Thank you, Commercial Service. Okay. Sorry, the slides are...
And thanks so much, Richard, and to all the presenters. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So to both Richard and all the presenters, we'll start here and come over to Brandon, and then keep your hands coming up, and we'll put you in the queue. Thanks.
Two questions. The first one is flow batteries. Can you tell me what the cost is? Because on one side, we saw BNEF showing $200 a kilowatt hour, dropping at 20% a year, which means in 3 years' time, if it goes at really 20%, it'll be $100 a year. And especially for grid and where long-term storage duration is a key part, that's one. So I'd like to you to answer that. The second question is to the panel and everybody else who has presented here is, what percentage of your business is actually coming out of China? Because if you look at this $300 billion investment that Renewable is talking about, almost 50% is China. So on the other hand, China is everywhere, supplying to everywhere at the lowest cost, but that market seems to be protected.
I would suggest all of the emerging markets are protected. You need to start with that assumption, work from that point of view. The cost in the federal auction markets by no means reflects the opportunity or the economic benefit case at the local level. So one of the reasons Brazil stopped the auctions is they had a huge problem with curtailment. So they were buying energy and throwing it away, in the simplest terms. You know, the wind power in Brazil, my Brazilian friends tell me, is the best wind energy on earth. It's the most consistent trade winds. Their peak hours actually are daytime hours. It's not a nighttime thing. So they get to use a lot of that energy. Here's the problem. Of course, the north and northeast of Brazil are a long ways from the consumers. So they don't have a grid infrastructure sufficient to absorb all of that energy. So, and to the auction today, even to this date, they don't pay any kind of time of use premium. It's a flat rate, and they just buy whatever you give them, and then they throw it away. So for a period of about 2 years, they, of course, under huge financial pressure, they stopped the auctions. Another difficult problem, stopping and starting and getting people all geared up. So now they're back in the auction business. They've got these new low bids that Ethan talked about that are phenomenal on paper. Let's see how easily they actually go to regulatory approval, and then of course the most important thing is bankable finance. And Brazil still to this day does not have finance. We're seeking Brazilian finance to fund our business. So as opposed to foreign direct aid. If there's anybody here who would like to talk to me about that, I would appreciate it. And then I'm going to let you, the group, you said to your last, clearly China. Oh, a flow battery. You know, today our flow battery sells for $375 US dollars per kilowatt hour today will be $225 per kilowatt hour. I tried not to make this a sales pitch. You know, I tried to stay away from that as much as possible. But what I can tell you is we are prepared to take lithium ion on in two categories. Long, you know, in the 4-hour space, they own the short duration market, no question. However, when you move to countries near the equator, where the ambient temperature can regularly be 40 degrees centigrade, 35, 40 C is every day. It's not some days. They have a serious disadvantage. Their AC round trip efficiency is almost obliterated, not quite. I also recently met with one of the largest independent energy providers in the world, I won't say who told me lithium ion isn't forever. We are rewriting the law on the fire safety hazard. We've decided that this is not a trivial thing, and you go and put that in a heavily environmentally regulated environment like Brazil, it is going to be a tough deal. For those of you that know the regulations, Obama controls every chemical energy storage device, and in Metro certification warrants the safety, security, and end-of-life recycling of the device. These added impediments and costs, what I call the all-in costs, we don't think we're that far away today. And in the emerging markets, it's long duration. You know, sure, the grid, this is where I say the one size fits all, take the US approach and try and plant it there, doesn't always work. So I do see applications that are 1 hour applications. So it does exist, but that's not the majority of applications. The majority are 4, 6, even 8 hours. And so the truth is that's a pretty tough use case. Suzanne?
Actually, I've got two other questions
I'm
here.
so
We're going to go
sorry.
right here, right here, Brandon, and then Suzanne.
Okay.
My name is Anna Manega. I am from Tanzania, but I live here
Would you
now.
speak up, please? Would you talk a little louder? I'm having a hard time hearing it.
Yes. My name is Anna Manega. I am from Tanzania, but I live here now. I am going to talk about the challenges talked about by the person who presented Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the problems you said was telecommunications.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. But when you say telecommunication, I would like to disagree with you. These days, almost everybody in Africa has a cell phone. So the one thing which is missing is not communication, telecommunication. Maybe the landline is what is missing. And I think it's time to develop something which matches with what is going on ground. So therefore, I think instead of wanting to your power companies to communicate by telephone, landline, to develop models which will communicate by cell phone. I've seen that one by prepaid meters, and the payment in East Africa, for example, Kenya and Tanzania, there's M-Pesa, there's whatever. There is no banking involved at all in payments of this thing, and it works. I go there frequently, and the issue of stealing while they have prepaid meters is not an issue. Another challenge you mentioned is one which is really endemic. I feel like the West is going to developing countries wanting to establish electricity the way it was established here in the 1900s. And I think that's a wrong way of approaching. Whether you are here in the United States for places which are rural, or where you are in Africa where electricity is scarce. We need to come up with other models of distributing electricity. I think renewable with the microgrid, standalone microgrids, is the solution for everywhere. There's also another, well, I can talk this forever because this is my passion. The sources of energy there, the sun, everybody knows, sub-Saharan, one of the things which make development there, economic development there difficult, is because it's sunny, arid, desert, and all those kind of things. So nobody is thinking of harvesting this to make what is bad to become a resource, to use whatever term we use here. So look, I couldn't believe somebody will live in Iceland, but Iceland has electricity continuous. I think Africa is, compared to Iceland, is so simple to develop energy which is sustainable. So briefly, I am advocating for anybody, anyone who wants to really deliver electricity, because I think that's the one thing for development in any society in the world right now. Please think of not going in the old ways. Think of microgrids, because there is a market for it. Right now, China is selling into the rural area where I grew up, but I have not been there, for a solar panel. And it's a solar panel kit with all the ingredients, and you can buy it, and you don't have to deal with the TANESCO, you don't have to deal with the power company or anything. The bad side of that is just for lighting and charging your cell phone and maybe TV. It doesn't cater for, and that's why development becomes difficult, economic development.
Thank you.
No, so fair point on the telecommunications point. I think that yes, I think the rate of sort of cell phone adoption in Africa in the last 5 years is astounding. I think where we see challenges from you make a fair point about the quality of that infrastructure to support more than just voice is where we see challenges to bring technologies that we've developed here to Africa, sub-Saharan in particular. But I think your point is bang on in terms of what will work from an electrification perspective in Africa is we can use the technologies that are available today that were not available even 10 years ago to solve that problem. Going back and doing this in the old, hub and spoke model makes absolutely no sense. So I fully agree with your point on microgrids being the answer. Absolutely.
Great, and we're almost out of time. We have three people in the queue. I'm going to take Brandon, and then if it's quick, we might be able to get.
Okay, I'll go super quick. Good presentation, Richard. Real quick on Latin America, our view is that the markets are going to need more flexibility. Power markets are going to need more flexibility as we bring variable resources on. So do you have any specific ideas about policy or regulatory changes, particularly related to energy markets, the auctions, and ancillary services markets to enable energy storage to be more of a participant?
Well, they're in need of something for every one of those things. And to start with the federal markets, they need a daily auction market. And they need, daily. Of course, it would be wonderful if they'd move all the way to something like we have here, hourly or peak, demand, energy resiliency, having spinning reserve at a given location at a certain, not literally spinning reserve, mind you, but the capacity to take on peak demand at certain hours of the day and stuff. The market is so unsophisticated at this point. They don't even pay in the federal auction any difference in the rate, no matter in a 24-hour day. Doesn't matter. So, and they buy all the energy they contracted for, whether they can actually use it or not. I mean, this is never going to work, to be honest. It's just never going to send the signal to create what they're really trying to get. They are just introducing time of use rates. So they're beginning to observe. I mean, they're smart people. I mean, the Ministry of Mines and Energy is not they're not naive. They're watching the net metering laws. They're watching the net metering laws go away in some places. They still have net metering laws. They're due to be revisited in March of 2019. So this is a presidential election year as well. So literally, nothing's going to happen until the new government is put in place. The new ministers then, of course, are assigned, and they go from there. So March, in my view, would be optimistic, not impossible. That's a year from now, nominally. As far as they've got to figure out how to separate distribution from generation. They've talked about that, and they're doing the same kinds of things here. So in terms of who's going to pay and where's the tariff, the other weakness of their current system, I would say, is demand charge. So once again, a demand charge is intended to send a signal to, look, if I've got to go bring this infrastructure to you and it's got to be reliable, then you've got to pay. Maybe, I don't know if this is true, the demand charges are very low there. I don't know if you've looked at any of these bills. So the bills are astronomically high, but the demand charges are, for example, very low. And so you ask yourself, the concern I have, I'll put it forth, is how would they ever do without the tax base that comes from selling energy? I mean, this is one of the easiest kinds of taxes. It's sort of like a VAT, and it's regressive. So as we talk about doing good in the world, it's the poorest people pay the most per kilowatt hour for energy, arguably higher, I don't know whether they're higher than Africa, I can't say because I don't know. But in Brazil, they certainly pay higher than any place else in Latin America. So I believe they need a complete redo. It would be my statement. That'll be potentially helpful, but possibly destabilizing. Just the idea that it's going to change leaves everybody sort of in limbo. They don't know what to do. All this issue of bankable finance. For you finance guys, just to give you a perspective, the typical discount rate for loans on solar, 10 to 12%. Imagine trying to create an NPV that makes sense for solar with a 10% discount rate. I mean, I would have to use some bad word I won't use. It's very tough.
Thanks so much, Richard. We are perfect. We're about to wrap up. One more final comment, and then we're going to break just a second.
Thank you. I thought I was going to be out of context. Early on, I wanted to ask the same question my Tanzanian friend raised, and that is that in Africa, at least from my background, in Africa, the biggest need for energy is in the rural areas, not so much in the urban areas. And infrastructure, the grid, is never going to reach the Rocky Mountain type of topography that we have in Ethiopia, for instance. And definitely the purchasing capacity is very low in the rural areas. But that's where the future market is going to be. 70 to 80% of the population in Ethiopia live in rural areas. And they're in the dark. And I think we can open slowly, but not necessarily in big scale. But we can open slowly that market. And that would be a win-win for everybody. That's my thought. Thank you.
Yeah, those are tough scenarios economically. I'm sure, again, my colleagues would echo that. But what I would say to look into is community supply. So you aggregate demand and you have some kind of an organization, but it's almost like a cooperative with a low overhead and a low footprint. Now, what's the chance of those types of organizations becoming sophisticated enough and because they're going to be responsible for maintenance and all kinds of things. So it's not an easy task, but that would be the way forward. So I agree with you. Hybrid microgrids, I've been hesitant to throw out a number, but you're probably talking something in the area of 30 cents a kilowatt hour, 30, 40 cents, which still it's high by the standards by which you would judge it, but it's low by the standards by which they would judge it. So that's where the economic opportunity lies, somewhere
Richard,
between there.
Thank you so much. I think many of us probably are ready for lunch break, so we don't want to distract you from that time. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our excellent speakers. And thank you for your time.